Thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. You know, if you're generating tens to hundreds of thousands of leads every year, then compliance should be an important part of your thinking. However, although we know some best practices, who are the groups that can help give us the guidance to stay away from regulators, lawsuits, and other similar problems? Rob Seaver is the Executive Director of LeadsCouncil, the online lead generation association, whose mission is to maintain a trusted association of vendors, buyers, and sellers, adhering to industry best practices. With his deep understanding and compliance in the performance marketing world, we'll discuss best practices in lead generation tactics. So let's listen in to a .org and a .shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Rob, thank you very much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective today. Really excited to talk about LeadsCouncil. So tell me a little bit about your background and your career history and what got you to LeadsCouncil.
Well, thank you, Kenneth, for letting us have the time to share today. My path to executive director of LeadsCouncil really wasn't a traditional path. As you can imagine, I don't know how many executive directors of associations there are out there, but there are not many. And mine came from way back 20 something years ago, being a direct marketer of print and mailing and owning my own print shop, getting heavily involved with companies like HP and just those traditional companies that were out there putting out presses. And I knew somewhere in the mid 2000s I had to change gears. Companies were going out of business, the economy was tanking, and I needed to do something differently. And I was rapidly approaching my 40s. So I took a small job at a company called Gannett. They were introducing a digital offering to their traditional newspaper and print and television advertisers, and
What's a newspaper?
started doing
Just kidding. It is
exactly.
we do have a pretty heavy focus on digital marketing. It was just a
Well, I will tell you that it was an interesting time in my life because that was where I truly understood the word millennial, because I got involved with a company that had 250 people fresh out of either high school or college, and they knew certainly more than anything I knew going into it.
sure.
And so it was a ground floor opportunity. So I did start though with direct inbound marketing, working with platforms like HubSpot, doing B2B, which was something different. I had traditionally done B2C work, and really just dove headfirst for 3 or 4 years into that world to learn what I could. I was recruited out of that world into a more traditional agency, doing some corporate marketing for them. And eventually that rolled into an opportunity to meet Corey Smith, who at the time was the showrunner for LeadsCon. And he explained that there was an opportunity coming up that he thought I would be great for. I listened to what he said, had absolutely zero understanding about compliance and regulatory issues as it related to marketing at the time, and dove headfirst February 2016 into this role and have not looked back.
Fantastic. So, talk a little bit about LeadsCouncil. It's the Online Lead Generation Association. Talk about your role, the company's role, the brand's role in helping performance marketers with compliance, with advocacy, with all those things. Tell us about LeadsCouncil. I know a lot of people, unless you go to certain marketing conferences, performance marketing conferences like a LeadsCon or a Connect to Convert, may not necessarily see it, but it's got a firm place and it's a board that we need. Talk a little bit about your role in the lead gen ecosphere, if you will.
Sure. Uh, as you had mentioned, LeadsCon is traditionally what people get us confused about. And a lot of times when I tell somebody I'm with LeadsCouncil, they'll go, "Oh, I know that conference."
Oh, well, you can't spell
And
LeadsCouncil
so
without LeadsCon.
you cannot. And we literally started around the same time with Jay Weintraub, who started the LeadsCon conference, which is what he's known for, starting conferences. And one of the reasons Leads Council came about was there was a need to keep the industry healthy. And in keeping the industry healthy, it would ensure that exhibitors and attendees would continue to show up for the shows. And so it was out of necessity, basically, that Leads Council was created. Fast forward 7, 8 years now, we are truly detached from LeadsCon in the sense that we're our own self-regulating nonprofit organization. We're our own entity. We're doing our own things. We're still closely connected at the hip with LeadsCon, obviously being one of the premier shows for lead generation and performance marketing. But we are doing our own initiatives now, and still working with that primary mission of advocating, educating, and lobbying on behalf of performance marketers and lead generators in the U.S. And we, over a period of the years, have gone through different iterations of membership, the cost for membership. But largely, if I look at my membership base now, and I include both paid and free memberships that we've provided over the years, we're about 450 members strong, and continuing to grow that base based on our most recent initiatives and some of our offerings and benefits that we're bringing to the table for our members.
That's outstanding. I didn't know it was even that big. That gives you a pretty broad base of ideas from a large group of people. So, talk about the promotional aspects of how you promote, say, correct lead gen approaches. I mean, there's a fine line between following best practices and lawsuits, and so having that type of counsel like yours to be able to help tell marketers what best practices to follow so that they can avoid those kind of pitfalls. Talk a little bit about how LeadsCouncil promotes that healthy online lead generation.
Sure. I mean, fundamentally, as a requirement for membership, we have a LeadsCouncil standards guide that's available on our website for download. It's a requirement of membership that you agree to those standards. They were largely created over the years in different evolutions, but they're lockstep in line with what regulators and legislators are saying they want to see from lead generation companies. And really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is say, hey, look, there are standards that we need to adhere to protect consumers. We know that this industry has a reputation for being gray hat at best, in some cases, black hat.
Mm-hmm.
We're not those types of people. We're people who understand what it takes to protect those consumers. We also understand and listen to what the regulators and legislators are telling us. And overwhelmingly, we're hearing that they want to see entities such as Leads Council lead the way in a self-regulating fashion, because right now they're losing the game as it relates to technology and keeping consumers safe. So the fact that we have an organization as large and as strong as we are, it's interesting to those regulators in the sense of there's another entity out there helping fight the fight on behalf of the consumers. And so everything at the core of that conversation starts and ends with those standards that we have and hold our members accountable to.
So let's talk a little bit then about the state of lead generation as you see it. And I'm not asking from necessarily the perspective of what vendors show up at conferences, but how much more of it focuses now, say, than 10 years ago, in your opinion, with compliance versus, say, performance? I mean, if you went to LeadsCon in its infancy, 11, 12 years ago, then you would have seen people selling a lot of leads that today you'd consider junk leads. Now, the focus is a lot more diverse. It's a lot more technology. It's a lot more compliance. It's a lot more everything else other than just somebody setting up a microsite and pushing some traffic for a lead. But talk a little bit about the state of lead generation as you and the council sees it.
Sure, and I'd like to take credit for what I'm about to say, but I was on a conversation this morning with Eric Josowich with All Web Leads. He's one of their SVPs of business development, and I asked him the same question, knowing that I was going to be on this podcast, and I love the answer that he gave me. It's fluid yet maturing, and in the sense of fluid, we always have to look at technology. Technology is leading the way on everything we do in any world. It doesn't just apply to lead generation and performance marketing. Technology is there for everything, right down to grocery shopping and putting fuel in your vehicle. But as it relates to lead generation and performance marketing in particular, technology is definitely on the forefront of not only the companies that practice it, but what keeps the regulators up at night. And so it's very fluid, it's very fast paced, it's changing every day. And you just absolutely have to get into a mindset that you have to do what you can to play that part. And on the flip side of that, the consumer, it's a very maturing industry in the sense that the technology is maturing, obviously, as I just talked about, but the consumer and their habits and their expectations and their understanding, their awareness of what the technology and the offerings are. For example, one of our members, Lending Tree, one of the largest lead providers in the mortgage and lending space. Um, when you ask a consumer today, if I'm going to go out and look for a loan, there are choices that they're already aware of. Lending Tree, Quicken Loans, these are things that over a period of the years, the consumer understanding of where to go look for these types of products and services is becoming more and more relevant to the technology and what we're bringing as lead generators to the consumer. And so, if I were to just summarize it using Eric's words from this morning, we're fluid, we're in a constant state of change, but we're maturing, and not only that technology, but in the consumer understanding and how to play their part in this ecosystem as well.
So then let's sort of dive into the fun and exciting part of LeadsCouncil, and that's compliance, the thing that everybody gets excited about with compliance for leads every morning. But again, it's such a fine line between being compliant and doing, performing a best practice, or doing something that's considered wrong and illegal, and then you're being sued. Talk about the hurdles that you see in compliance in general. I think we've seen a lot of changes with TCPA compliance. We're obviously seeing a lot of things that will begin to emerge that much more with GDPR that just went into effect this year. Talk a little bit about the compliance and how, if that's what your thoughts are. I mean, how much more compliance versus how much less? How have you seen sort of those changes over the years and where we are
Well,
today?
there's definitely a focus. I think one of the things that I can fall back on is one of our other members put it to me in a way that I could understand it a little bit more easily. The inevitability of failing in the world of compliance is right around every corner. It's just too
Such a good
it's
point.
too cumbersome, it's too large, it changes daily to keep up with the rules and this agency versus this agency and what they're doing. The best thing that you can do is try to adopt practices that you know are fair, that you know aren't deceptive, that you know follow the largest rules of the road, which in general are our standards. That's how we developed our standards. We're at a high enough level to where these were the absolute minimums that you should be doing. And so the inevitability of failure is probably likely in the cases of some of these companies doing millions upon millions of transactions per month. And so it isn't a game so much of, absolute compliance as much as ensuring that every single step along the way you're doing the very best you can to be compliant. And having said that, when you look at some of the more recent rulings and judgments that are out there and enforcements that we see, there is a definite line that the regulator looks at first and foremost. What was the intent? If this was just a failure of you to follow some of the rules, that's one thing. If it was done maliciously with intent, that's a very different thing. And those fines, to give you an example, in just a TCPA world, they could range from $500 per instance to $1,500 per instance. And a lot of that has to do with what was the intent behind the action. And so what we're wanting to instill in our members is that your intent should be 100% compliant, understanding the complexities and the problems and hurdles that you face in trying to deliver these services. As it relates to GDPR, obviously, for the last year, we've been somewhat force-fed as it relates to what Europe is doing in their email marketing campaigns. Very opt-in, very controlled way of communicating. And unless you were doing business with people in Europe, a lot of people just didn't pay attention to it. A lot of the larger companies, obviously, with a European presence, had to comply and conform. But we don't see anything today going on in the United States actively. What we do know, though, is with what happened most recently, and you saw this smashed across your TV and other news outlets, what's going on with privacy and Facebook and Google. This is putting that message and the timing with GDPR right back into the eyes of the legislators and regulators. And what we are seeing even at the federal level, although they're talking about it, what we feel will happen is a, a state like California, which has proposed legislation in place to talk about GDPR, once that happens in one state, the ability for you to determine whether or not one of your records in your database is in California or in Idaho, it's nearly impossible. It doesn't matter what you have as a record of address. California won't care. If you're marketing to somebody in California, you better be compliant with whatever rules they push forward. So what we believe is if one state adopts it, especially before the federal government does, we'll be forced as an industry, especially nationally based industry, we'll be forced as an industry to adopt whatever that first state's initiatives are. And so it's coming. We just don't know when and what fashion it'll be here, but it's coming, and it's probably coming sooner than later. Now, having said that, this is a crazy world that in the world of compliance and regulatory that we're seeing today. And a lot of it has to do with the administration change that happened last year. So it's a very, very fluid state. Who knows where we're going to end up? I don't think we'll ever go back to where we see the federal government being largely the rulers of the compliance and regulatory space. I think this is to change a change that's for the foreseeable future for sure.
So let's talk then, just high level, briefly tell me where you see compliance and when you look at across different verticals. I mean, if you look at home services versus education versus insurance versus any other industry, obviously there's based on what people are collecting and needing can be completely different needs. But if you sort of had to take a 30,000 foot view of maybe the challenges in those, where do you see those challenges across different verticals?
I think there's one challenge that's synonymous across every single vertical that stands out. You had mentioned it earlier, TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which goes hand in hand with the Do Not Call list, which also goes hand in hand with the TSR, which is the Telephone Sales and Marketing Rules. These were all largely initiatives that were put in place to protect the consumer for unwanted telephone calls. But as I had mentioned earlier, when we look at where the FTC's focus is, specifically at the federal level, um, they reported that from 2016 to 2017, the complaints for unwanted phone calls rose 33%. And when I say 33%, we're looking at complaints yearly going from 5.5 million to just over 7 million. That is overwhelming the agency. And so, therefore, when you go to the FTC and talk about what is the public enemy number one, it is unwanted robocalls. And that hits every single vertical
I
right
literally just
squarely
got
in the
one while we
face.
were on this call. So,
Right. That must have been the buzz I heard was
yeah,
an
that's
unwanted
exactly what it
phone
was.
call.
Yeah,
Well, I will tell you that that was somebody that is not a member of
exactly.
Leads Council. I can assure you that. But but I will say that um, we get it. as consumers, we're all consumers in the industry first
Hmm.
and foremost before we're business owners or people connected to the industry. And so we all get that an unwanted phone call is just that. It's a pain. It's something that's unwanted. We want to see them go away. And they're largely being done by actors either overseas or people who understand the rules and are just intent on breaking the rules and violating them. They're playing a sheer number game and hoping that they can get enough before they get shut down. And so they aren't largely the people who were out there from a compliance standpoint. But as with anything, the few bad apples really ruin it for everybody that's also in the game. And so we're forced daily to address TCPA rulings. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, as that fight drifts even further away from the FTC, and we look at more of the state initiatives that are going on, it's truly a wild, wild west out there.
Hmm.
You can go from California to West Virginia, for example, illegal spoofing of phone call numbers, which we all see where a local number will come in. You answer it thinking it's somebody locally. It's just another robocall. The illegal part comes from when you hang up and try to call that number back and you can't get the person who tried to call you. It's not illegal to have a local phone number. It's illegal to use it and not be able to, from the consumer standpoint, call that number back. In West Virginia, there was proposed legislation to criminalize and make that a felony. So some of these states are really taking up the issue of unwanted phone calls at a level that even the federal government isn't doing. We're seeing cases, class action cases against large companies, J.P. Morgan Chase, DirecTV, Dish Network, Bank of America, you name it, as it relates to these large organizations that are being hit with class action lawsuits of just unwanted phone calls. And some of those go back several years. So I wouldn't want to categorize everybody in the bucket that I just said as not having a compliant program today. But a lot of these initiatives, enforcement actions are going back, 3, 4, 5, 7 years,
Hmm.
and that's what you're hearing about. But all of them are resulting in multi-million-dollar settlements. The FTC is serious, and they're making that clear to anybody out there making phone calls.
So you mentioned bad actors, and I know you've got a new service called Dial Safe coming out, and it's for members to help contribute and consume those bad actors. Talk a little bit about that new. I mean, it's an exciting proposition coming from LeadsCouncil. Talk a little bit about Dial Safe.
Yeah, probably the most exciting thing that we've seen or been part of in since our inception, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. We talk about the consumer not wanting to get that call, but on behalf of the lead generator, the person that's out there expending resource, actually paying to make that call, they don't want to make the call either. They don't want to call a consumer that doesn't want to be called. And so we work with some of the largest agencies and call centers across America, and they're all sitting on data. And that data is categorized in were they happy to receive that call, or did they say I don't want to see this call again, or I don't want to have this call again? And so when these records are marked as do not call, they typically go into that internal database, and that company won't call on that consumer any longer. In addition to that, there are people out there that are intent in suing, litigators, known professional litigators, that their sole purpose in life is to take advantage of some of the loopholes within the law, and they're out there waiting for somebody to call them. And as soon as they call, they're throwing a letter to the company saying, "Hey, look, you owe me X dollars, and I want to get paid." And a lot of times the company, just because of the cost of fighting that, they'll pay it and go about their business. But those records obviously go into another database. And so understanding that we have all these members that do these calls and sit on all of this data that is very unique, very powerful, at the end of the day, out there to protect the consumer, the thought was, how can we take technology, which is available, contribute that data to a centralized database, and then as a member benefit, be able to bump up against that data to see whether or not the number you're going to call is on somebody else's do not call list. Especially, and more importantly, is it on one of those litigator lists of somebody that's already proven that they're going to sue? And so this overwhelmingly has been a benefit that has been positive in its initial when we're out there talking about it. The response has been great. We're working at the latter stages. We're in beta right now, and literally this will be a database of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of numbers shared across our membership and accessible by our members to help have one other tool in their arsenal to keep from calling consumers who don't want to be called.
That's fantastic. So, you know, I really love the fact that you've got what we were talking about earlier about having 450 marketers and people that are in the performance marketing lead gen business as part of the Leads Council. But talk a little bit, if you will, about membership, how people get involved. We obviously need to encourage more and more to get involved, to follow those best practices. But how does somebody get involved in potential membership with Leads Council?
Well, the first thing they can do is certainly go to the website leadscouncil.org. There's a lot of information on what we're doing and especially the membership. And obviously, I said that you could download our standards. I think that one of the things we have to do is back up and look at our DNA, where we were formed and how we started and grown to where we are today. The bulk of our members have come from that LeadsCon ecosystem, and LeadsCon is largely made up of aggregators, lead generators, lead sellers, and advertisers. And then we've got the lead buyers, people who consume those leads, buying them from those people. Traditionally, that ecosystem has been lopsided in the sense of who contributes the most amount of money. And so when I say that, the lead generator bears most of the weight of the burden of getting that lead to the buyer, and then the buyer is largely courted by the lead generator to buy leads. And so that's how our membership has been formed and traditionally is set up. So we have platinum, gold, and silver memberships. They are largely there for the lead generator, the aggregator, the platform, somebody that's in compliance, maybe a Jornaya, an active prospect, a Velocify, Performline, companies like that. They traditionally are the people who are bearing most of the brunt of membership. It's very expensive to go out and lobby and advocate on behalf of the industry. For example, I'll give you one small insight to what that could be. In California, there's active legislation on the table in the lending space that has a direct impact and hit on lead generators that are in the lending space in California. It was something where we felt like we needed to be there, and the cost of lobbying and finding a lobbyist that can do the job for us, and not so much to fight the legislation, but control some of the input that goes into that. We are certainly agreeing that some of this legislation is important for the consumer, but we also want to have a seat at the table. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $11,000 a month to hire a lobbyist. So this is a very expensive game to go out there and try to play. And so we need people who can contribute those types of dollars to allow us to go out and do what we're doing. And so that's what our platinum, gold, and silver members are made up of. And they're traditionally the cost of that is brunted with the aggregator, lead generator, and the platform out there. Then we also have the buyer side. The buyer side, we have an understanding that their risk in the game is less. A lot of buyers feel like the responsibility from a compliance and regulatory front falls on the person they're buying the lead from, the person that generated the lead. And so we understand that that's the traditional way the ecosystem has been set up. And so we have a reduced fee membership for those buyers that's very reasonable, all of which have different benefits, such as our dial safe baked in to them. We have discounts to LeadsCon um, uh, 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 conferences, and there are other things that we do. We have active education. We do webinars monthly. We put out industry studies from some of the leaders in the industry that provide us with that information. And so it's a large role and it's a very expensive role. And so we need members who are out there who understand that it's everyone's role to play this part in this self-regulating world that the regulators are saying that they want. So we put products together, membership products together that suit the entire suite of the ecosystem.
I think it's been a great conversation, especially when you see the value of having a .org like yourself, who represents that consumer as much as you do the agencies in a way. And whether it's through data that comes from, like we talked about with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and that, or if it's TCPA and robocalls, or if it is, GDPR, which is a great unknown for many organizations who are spending a lot of money on legal fees right now. Having a group like yourself that can educate marketers a lot more in lead buyers and lead producers. It's just, there's really a great need, and I see it as a great fit. So Rob, thank you again for joining us on A Shark's Perspective today, and look forward to seeing you at many more performance marketing conferences to come. And everybody can find you at LeadsCouncil.org. So thank you, Rob, again.
Absolutely.
For your time.
Thank you, Kenneth. Had a great time.
So there was my conversation with Rob Seaver, the Executive Director of the Leads Council, and let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from that conversation. First, technology is leading the way in lead generation and performance marketing. It's what's on the mind and on the forefront of companies employing it. It's what keeps the regulators up at night as well. And on the flip side, though, for the consumer, their habits and expectations with technologies and offerings is maturing. The consumer understanding is becoming more relevant to the technology and lead generators. It's fluid yet maturing and constantly changing. Second, with compliance, to keep up with the rules, the best thing you can do is try to adopt practices that you know are fair, that you know are not deceptive, that you know follow the rules of the road, that are standards, that are at least the absolute minimum that you should be doing. Third, absolute compliance is often doing the very best you can just to be compliant. Remember that there is a definitive line that the regulators look at in regards to intent. A TCPA violation, for example, can run anywhere from $500 to $1,500 per instance, and that amount changes just based on intent. Your intent should be 100% compliance. Got a question? Then feel free to find me on LinkedIn or send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this show regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. Now go out there and make you and your company some money, and join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.